In the final years of the 10th century, Adalbert, the Bishop of Prague, stood before his Duke, Boleslaus II, his heart heavy with a terrible truth. He looked out from the high castle walls, not at a city of God, but at what he called a throne of Satan. He saw the immense wealth of his city, the magnificent new stone churches, and the armed retainers of the Duke, and he knew the source of it all. It was a fortune purchased with human souls. He confronted his Christian ruler, his voice ringing with a desperate and dangerous piety. "O Duke," he cried, "you are the master of these people, but their price is your soul's damnation." He condemned the great marketplace below, a forum not just for furs and amber, but for the buying and selling of human beings, a brutal trade that had made Prague one of the richest cities in Europe. This was the central, horrifying paradox of the age. A Christian prince, in a Christian city, was funding the creation of his Christian state with the profits from a vast, industrial-scale slave trade. This is the story of that trade, the forgotten chains that bound a continent and secretly forged the nations of Central Europe. In the 10th century, Europe was a continent of stark contrasts, a landscape of nascent powers and ancient riches, separated by vast distances and deep ideological divides. In the far southwest, the Iberian Peninsula was dominated by a glittering exception to the continent's fragmentation, the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba. Al-Andalus was not merely a kingdom, it was an intellectual and economic superpower. Its capital, Cordoba, was a city of 500,000 souls, with paved streets, public baths, and a level of wealth and learning that dwarfed any Christian city north of the Pyrenees. Its great mosque was an architectural marvel, its palaces were wonders of the age, and its treasury overflowed with a torrent of silver dirhams and gold dinars, the profits of a sophisticated agricultural and manufacturing economy. But this immense prosperity and political stability rested on a foundation that required a constant, massive, and very specific import: human beings. The caliphs of Cordoba had built their power on the backs of an elite class of slave soldiers and administrators known as the Sakaliba. These were fair-skinned slaves, captured from the frontiers of Europe, brought to Cordoba, and raised with a fanatical loyalty to the caliph alone, forming a Praetorian guard that insulated him from the intrigues of Arab and Berber clan politics. The demand for these Sakaliba, and for the thousands of other slaves needed to service the vast households and workshops of Al-Andalus, was insatiable. It was a demand backed by a river of silver. Thousands of miles to the northeast, beyond the organized realms of the German emperors, lay a vast and violent sea of humanity, the Slavic frontier. This was not a unified nation, but a bewildering mosaic of tribes: the Palabians, the Sorbs, the Veleti, the Pomeranians, a shatter zone of fierce, independent peoples who had not yet been consolidated into kingdoms or converted to Christianity. To the German knights and nobles on their western flank, this was the terra incognita, a pagan wilderness to be feared, fought, and, increasingly, harvested. The endemic state of warfare among the Slavic tribes themselves produced a constant stream of prisoners. Furthermore, their pagan status placed them outside the moral and legal protection of the Christian world. To the pragmatic minds of the 10th century, this region was a natural resource, a seemingly inexhaustible reservoir of souls, a place where the raw material for the great slave markets of the South could be found in abundance. Between this immense source of supply and this wealthy center of demand lay a geographical and political choke point, a place perfectly situated to become the great central marketplace, the processing hub for this continental trade in human flesh. This place was the city of Prague. Nestled in the defensible basin of the Vltava River, the fortress of the Přemyslid dukes was shielded from the chaos of the eastern frontier and the direct reach of the German emperors. It sat astride the ancient east-west trade routes, a natural meeting point for the warriors who captured the slaves, the merchants who brokered them, and the silver that paid for them. It was here, in the heart of a nominally Christian duchy, that the grim logic of the 10th century economy would create one of the largest and most notorious slave markets in the world. As the Jewish merchant and diplomat Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, a rare eyewitness to the city in its prime, would later report, Prague was a boomtown built of stone and lime. its wealth derived from a commerce that shocked and astonished him. This documentary will argue that this engine of flesh was the primary economic driver that forged the first great states of Central Europe. We will follow the forgotten chains of this brutal trade, from the violent raids on the Slavic frontier to the grim marketplace of Prague, and down the long, sorrowful road to the opulent palaces of Cordoba. But most importantly, we will follow the money. We will demonstrate how the river of Islamic silver that flowed back in the opposite direction was the foundational capital that allowed the dukes of Bohemia and Poland to fund their armies, mint their first national currencies, and build the stone castles and churches that cemented their power. This is the story of a dark and bloody bargain, a foundational history of state building that was so morally compromised that it was, for 1,000 years, almost completely and deliberately forgotten. Before a single chain was shackled in the marketplace of Prague, before a single silver dirham began its long journey north from Cordoba, the raw material for the entire enterprise had to exist. The great, forgotten slave trade of the 10th century was not a creation from nothing. It was the brutal commercial exploitation of a vast and pre-existing human resource. To understand the engine of flesh that powered the birth of Central Europe, one must first journey to its source, the immense, unconquered, and tragically fragmented world of the Western Slavs. This was not a kingdom or an empire. It was a sea of humanity, a mosaic of tribes and tongues stretching from the Elbe River in the west to the Vistula and beyond in the east, a land that the organized, literate civilizations of Christendom and Islam viewed as a mysterious, primitive, and, above all, harvestable frontier. This was the great reservoir of souls, a territory whose political disunity and pagan faith made its people the most vulnerable and sought after commodity in 10th century Europe. To the German nobles of the newly forged Ottonian Empire, the lands across the Elbe were the edge of the world. They called this territory the Limes Sorabicus, the Sorbian March, a land of dark forests, impassable marshes, and a bewildering array of pagan peoples. These were the Polabian Slavs, a great branch of the Slavic language family, who had settled these lands in the centuries after the fall of Rome. They were not a single people, but a constellation of tribal unions and chieftaincies, each with its own identity and its own fierce independence. In the north, along the Baltic coast, lived the Velidi and the Obautrites. Further south were the Sorbs, the Lusatians, and the Haveli. They were a hardy, agricultural people, living in small villages and protected by formidable wooden hill forts called gords. They were master builders in earth and timber, skilled warriors, and devout followers of a complex polytheistic faith, worshipping gods of thunder, sun, and forest like Perun and Svarog in sacred groves and wooden temples. Their society was tribal, organized around the loyalty a warrior owed to his chieftain, and their politics were a constant, swirling vortex of alliances, betrayals, and low-level warfare. This endemic state of internal conflict was the first great source that fed the reservoir of captives. Warfare among the Slavic tribes was a constant feature of life, but it was not the total war of modern states. It was a kind of violent, high-stakes competition, fought not for territorial conquest in the way a Roman emperor would understand it, but for power, prestige, resources, and, critically, for captives. A successful raid on a rival tribe's village or gord was the primary way for a chieftain to enhance his standing and enrich his followers. The captured cattle and grain were valuable, but the captured people were the ultimate prize. They were a living, walking form of wealth. A captive could be ransomed back to their family for a price in furs, amber, or iron tools. A skilled captive, like a blacksmith or a weaver, could be assimilated into the tribe to increase its productive capacity. A young woman could be taken as a wife or concubine, or, most ominously, a captive could be sold. Long before the great market at Prague became an international hub, a localized trade in prisoners of war already existed among the Slavic tribes themselves. This brutal internal economy established a foundational principle that would have horrific consequences. It commodified human beings. It created a world where the capture and sale of a person was a normal, if unfortunate, outcome of the constant state of war. Into this already violent and fragmented world came a new, powerful, and highly organized external pressure, the German Drang nach Osten, the drive to the east. The Ottonian emperors who succeeded Charlemagne, rulers like Henry the Fowler and Otto the Great, saw the Slavic frontier not just as a border to be defended, but as a territory to be pacified, converted, and exploited. Their policy was a potent and self-serving mixture of religious zeal, political ambition, and raw economic greed. The official justification for their constant campaigns into the Slavic lands was a holy one. These were pagans, idolaters who lived outside the saving grace of the Church. To wage war upon them was a pious act, a way of expanding the frontiers of Christendom and eventually bringing souls to Christ, even if it was by the point of a sword. This religious ideology provided a powerful moral and legal framework that dehumanized the Slavic tribes. In the eyes of a Saxon knight, a Slavic warrior was not a man defending his home. He was a heathen, an enemy of God. The rules that governed warfare within Christendom, such as the nascent Peace of God movement which sought to limit violence, simply did not apply across the Elbe. This holy war provided the perfect cover for a far more pragmatic and profitable enterprise, slave raiding on an industrial scale. The German margraves and dukes, who commanded the eastern frontier, men like the infamous Gero, who ruled the Saxon Eastern March with an iron fist, were warrior entrepreneurs. Their campaigns, or razzias, were less about permanent conquest and more about smash-and-grab operations for plunder. They would lead their armored heavy cavalry, a force of shock and awe that the more lightly equipped Slavic warriors could rarely withstand in open battle, on devastating raids deep into the pagan heartlands. They would storm the wooden gourds, burn the villages, and return not just with tribute, but with long coffles of chained captives. For these German nobles, the slave trade was a critical part of their business model. They were often engaged in their own power struggles within the complex feudal politics of the German Empire, and they needed a source of liquid wealth to pay their retainers and build their stone castles. The silver mines that would later enrich Germany had not yet been discovered. The sale of Slavic captives to brokers on the frontier was the quickest and most efficient way to turn military success into hard cash. This grim synergy between internal Slavic warfare and external German raiding created a perfect storm. The reservoir of souls was being filled from both within and without. The constant pressure from the German knights exacerbated the conflicts among the Slavic tribes, who would often ally with the Germans against their own local rivals, paying for German military support with a share of the captives taken in a joint raid. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of violence and exploitation. The entire territory east of the Elbe became a vast, militarized hunting ground. A person living in this world could be captured in a raid by a rival tribe and sold to a traveling merchant. They could be taken by a Saxon warband and marched back to a German border market. They could be a non-combatant, a farmer or a weaver, swept up in the chaos of a siege. Their fate was the same. They ceased to be a person and became a slave, the German word derived from Slav, that would give the world its modern term for human chattel. The final element that made this entire system possible was the legal and moral vacuum in which it operated. The canon law of the Church was clear. A Christian was forbidden from enslaving another Christian. While this rule was often bent, it was a powerful prohibition, but it did not apply to pagans. The enslavement of a pagan was not considered a sin. In fact, some theologians argued it was a form of mercy, as a pagan slave in a Christian land might eventually be exposed to the gospel and saved, a twisted justification that oiled the wheels of the entire machine. This created a stark, bright line. The act of baptism was, in effect, a shield against the slave trade. This is precisely why the first great Slavic dukes to the east, like Mieszko of Poland, would eventually embrace Christianity for their entire people in a single, strategic move. It was an act of mass inoculation against the predatory raids of their neighbors. But for the unconverted tribes of the 10th century, Their pagan faith was a death sentence. It stripped them of their humanity in the eyes of their captors and made them a legitimate commodity, no different from a fur pelt or a barrel of salt. The vast, unconquered Slavic frontier was thus a perfect source, a tragedy of geography, politics, and religion. It was a land filled with people, but it was a land without the unity, the military technology, or the religious shield to protect them. The reservoir was full and constantly overflowing. All that was needed now was a channel, a place to build the dam and the sluice gates, a central market to consolidate this human river and direct its flow to the highest bidder. That place would be Prague. A trade route is a circuit. For the immense humans suffering on the Slavic frontier to be so brutally and systematically monetized, there had to be more than just a supply. There had to be a customer, a market of such immense scale and wealth that its gravitational pull could be felt a continent away. The force that turned the sporadic violence of the eastern frontier into a coherent, industrial-scale enterprise was the insatiable appetite of a single, enormously wealthy customer, the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba. In the 10th century, Al-Andalus, as Muslim Iberia was known, was the richest, most powerful, and most sophisticated state in Europe. Its glittering capital, Cordoba, was a metropolis that dwarfed the provincial towns of the Christian north. This Andalusi civilization was a marvel of the age, but its unique political and military structure rested upon a foundation of imported human beings. The caliphate had a deep, structural, and relentless demand for a specific type of slave, the fair-skinned peoples of the north, whom they called the Sakaliba. It was the river of silver and gold flowing from the treasuries of Cordoba that was the ultimate driver of the entire trans-European slave trade. The term Sakaliba, which is simply the Arabic rendering of the word Slavs, came to be a generic term for all European slaves of a certain type, pale-skinned, often fair-haired, and from outside the borders of the Islamic world. To the rulers of Cordoba, these were not just common laborers, they were the raw material for the creation of a new and fundamentally more reliable form of power. The Umayyad caliphs, from Abd al-Rahman III onwards, faced a constant internal threat. Their authority was challenged by the intricate and often violent rivalries of the great Arab clans who had conquered Spain and the Berber tribes of North Africa who made up a large part of their armies. To rely on these factions for their personal security was a dangerous gamble. Their loyalty was always conditional, always subject to the shifting sands of clan politics. The caliphs needed a power base that was loyal to them and to them alone, a force that had no family, no tribe, and no allegiance other than to the ruler who owned them. The Sakaliba were the solution to this problem. Young Slavic and other European boys, captured on the frontiers and transported to Cordoba, were brought into the palace system. They were converted to Islam, taught Arabic, and put through a rigorous program of military and administrative training. They were, in essence, remade. Stripped of their past, their language, and their kinship, their entire world revolved around the person of the caliph. He was their master, their patron, and their only source of advancement. This produced a class of elite slave soldiers and administrators of ferocious loyalty and competence. By the reign of Abd al-Rahman III, the Sakaliba had become the backbone of the state. They formed the caliph's personal bodyguard, a force of thousands of heavily armed and impeccably trained soldiers who were utterly immune to the factional politics of the Arab aristocracy. They served as the senior administrators of the palace, the treasurers, the chamberlains, and the diplomats, a perfectly reliable bureaucracy that owed its entire existence to the caliph. The demand for a constant supply of these young, intelligent, and physically imposing European boys was therefore a matter of the highest state security. It was a demand that the rulers of Cordoba were willing to pay for with the immense wealth of their treasury. A second, parallel demand was for eunuchs. The structure of the Umayyad court, like that of the Abbasids in Baghdad, was centered on the institution of the harem, the vast, sequestered private quarters of the ruler's wives, concubines, and children. The administration and guarding of this private world, according to the customs of the age, could only be entrusted to men who posed no sexual threat, eunuchs. The Sakaliba were the primary source for this grimly specialized class of servant. A significant portion of the young boys brought from the Slavic lands were subjected to castration, a brutal and often fatal procedure to fit them for a life of service within the palace walls. Those who survived could rise to positions of immense power and trust. As keepers of the harem, they were the ultimate insiders, privy to the innermost secrets of the dynasty. They often controlled access to the caliph himself and could wield enormous influence as advisors and confidants. The demand for these high-status, trusted servants was constant, and because the procedure itself was forbidden within the boundaries of Islam, it created a massive market for eunuchs who had been processed in the Christian lands to the north before being imported. Beyond these two elite classes of palace slaves, the booming economy of Al-Andalus created a much broader demand for labor. The Caliphate was in the midst of a spectacular construction boom. Abd al-Rahman III and his successors poured their immense wealth into architectural projects designed to showcase their power and piety. The great mosque of Cordoba was expanded again and again, becoming one of the largest and most breathtaking buildings in the world. On a hillside outside the capital, the Caliph built a legendary palace city from scratch, Madinat al-Zahra, a sprawling complex of palaces, offices, and gardens so magnificent it was known as the Versailles of the Middle Ages. These projects required a colossal workforce. While much of the skilled labor was done by paid artisans, a significant portion of the brutal, back-breaking work quarrying the stone, transporting the materials, and performing the endless manual labor was done by legions of state-owned slaves. The Sakaliba were a key component of this labor force, their lives spent building the monuments that would glorify the dynasty that had enslaved them. This multifaceted and insatiable demand was backed by an economy of unparalleled wealth. Al-Andalus in the 10th century was an economic powerhouse. Its advanced irrigation techniques had turned the Guadalquivir Valley into the most productive agricultural land in Europe, exporting grain, olives, and wine. Its industries produced the finest silks, leather goods, and ceramics on the continent. Its cities were vibrant hubs of commerce, and its treasury was filled with a steady supply of gold from the mines of West Africa, which it accessed via the trans-Saharan trade routes, and a flood of silver from its own reopened Roman-era mines and from trade. The caliphs of Cordoba had the means to pay for what they wanted, and what they wanted, above all else, was a steady supply of the human raw material that secured their power and built their world. The Jewish merchant and diplomat from Tortosa, Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, who visited the court of the German Emperor Otto Affine in 965 and later traveled to Prague, provides the crucial link in his famous account. He described the lands of the Slavs as a source of captives, and he described the economy of Al-Andalus, noting the immense power of the Sakaliba at court and the flow of currency. But most importantly, he noted the direction of the trade and the form of the payment. The slaves, he observed, were brought from the Slavic lands to be sold in Al-Andalus, and the payment that flowed back was not in barter goods, but in hard, valuable currency, Islamic silver dirhams. He saw the two ends of the circuit. The appetite of the Caliphate was the engine, and its silver was the fuel. It was a demand so powerful it could create a gravitational pull that warped the economies of entire kingdoms 1,000 miles away. It was a demand that would turn a remote Bohemian hill fort into the greatest slave market in Europe. Nestled in the protective embrace of the Vltava River, the hill fort of Prague in the mid-10th century was a place undergoing a violent and spectacular transformation. What had been a modest tribal stronghold of the Přemyslid clan was rapidly becoming one of the most important and wealthiest cities in all of Europe. Its growth was not based on rich farmland, a royal court of great renown, or the production of fine crafts. Prague's boom was built on a single brutal commodity. It had become the central crossroads, the great international marketplace, the processing hub for the continental trade in human flesh. It was here, in this fortress city, perched between the Slavic frontier and the organized states of Germany, that the human raw material of the north was consolidated, graded, and sold to the brokers who would transport it to the insatiable markets of the south. For a crucial century, Prague was the engine of flesh, a city whose streets, according to eyewitnesses, were filled with the grim spectacle of chained captives and the glint of the Islamic silver that paid for them. Our most vivid and indispensable portrait of this boomtown comes from the pen of Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, a Spanish Jewish merchant, diplomat, and likely a spy who traveled through Central Europe around the year 965. His account is not a fairy tale. It is the hard-headed report of an experienced man of commerce, and what he saw in Prague astonished him. He described it as a city built of stone and lime, a sign of significant wealth and permanence that set it apart from the simple wooden gourds of the surrounding lands. He noted that it was the greatest city of trade in the region, a magnet for merchants from all over the world. He saw merchants from the nearby German lands, and, most significantly, Muslims and Jews from the land of the Turks, likely the Khazar Khaganate, who had traveled immense distances to participate in its markets. Prague was not a local backwater. It was a truly international emporium. Ibrahim ibn Yaqub meticulously catalogued the goods on display in the city's great marketplace. There were the expected products of the region: fine furs, hides, tin, and lead. But he saves his most detailed and emphatic description for the primary commodity, the one that clearly dominated all others. The most important trade, he wrote, is the trade in slaves. His account is stark and unsentimental. He describes long coffles of captives, chained together at the neck, being brought to the market. He notes that the city is a hub for brokers who purchase these people for sale in the south. His report is the smoking gun, the undeniable first-hand evidence that places Prague at the absolute epicenter of this vast and brutal commerce. The city's wealth, its stone buildings, its international character, all of it was being financed by the buying and selling of human beings. The geography and politics of the 10th century had made Prague the perfect location for this grim enterprise. It was strategically situated just beyond the direct administrative reach of the powerful German Ottonian Empire, giving its Bohemian rulers a crucial degree of autonomy. Yet, it was close enough to the German lands to be easily accessible to the Saxon knights and nobles who were the primary raiders and suppliers of Slavic captives. It sat on the nexus of ancient east-west trade routes that ran from the Rhineland to the Kievan Rus, and the emerging north-south routes that would become the pathway to the Mediterranean. It was, in essence, a perfectly positioned free port, a semi-independent zone where the brutal business of the frontier could be laundered into international commerce. The Přemysliv dukes of Bohemia, particularly the ambitious Boleslaus I, were not passive observers of this trade. They were its primary beneficiaries and its guarantors. They provided the military security that made the great market possible, and in return, they levied a tax on every transaction, a customs duty on every slave bought and sold. This tax became the foundational revenue stream of the nascent Bohemian state, the gusher of cash that would fund all their other ambitions. The great marketplace in Prague, likely located in the lesser town below the main castle hill, would have been a scene of controlled chaos, a place of immense human suffering and staggering profitability. Here, the various streams of the slave trade converged. Saxon knights would arrive with their latest captives from raids across the Elbe. Polish and other Slavic chieftains would bring their prisoners of war to sell for hard currency. Local Bohemian warriors would return from their own forays into the pagan frontier. The captives themselves were a diverse and tragic cross-section of the Slavic world: warriors, farmers, women, and children, all ripped from their homes and now treated as livestock. They would have been held in guarded pens, inspected by potential buyers who would check their teeth, their musculature, and their general health. It was in Prague that the processing of this human cargo took place. This was where the raw material of the frontier was prepared for the specific high-end demands of the Cordoban market. The most horrific part of this process was castration. The immense demand for eunuchs in Al-Andalus as servants for the palaces and harems created a specialized and highly lucrative branch of the trade. According to multiple sources, this brutal and dangerous procedure was often carried out not in the Islamic world itself, but in the Christian frontier cities that supplied the slaves. While Verdun in France is often cited as a major center, the sheer scale of the Prague market suggests it was also a primary location for this grim specialization. Here, captive boys would be subjected to the operation. Those who survived the procedure and the subsequent recovery period would see their value increase exponentially, becoming one of the most precious commodities that could be shipped south. The primary brokers who managed the final purchase and the long-distance transport from Prague were, according to Ibrahim ibn Yaqub and other sources, Jewish merchants. These were likely the same class of globe-spanning traders as the Radhanites, or their direct successors. Their unique position as a neutral third party, their vast network of trusted agents that stretched from Germany to Spain, and their mastery of long-distance finance made them the only group who could efficiently and reliably manage this transcontinental trade. They were the ones who could consolidate the captives purchased in Prague, organize the vast caravans needed for the journey, navigate the complex political landscape of Francia, and ultimately deal with their co-religionists and other merchants in the great markets of Cordoba. They were the master brokers, the specialists who connected the violent world of the Slavic frontier to the wealthy, demanding world of Al-Andalus, with the city of Prague serving as their essential, blood-soaked central exchange. For a brief, terrible, and foundational period, Prague was the Wall Street of the 10th century slave trade, a crossroads of flesh whose profits would lay the first stone and mint the first coin of a new European nation. A vast and complex enterprise like the Prague slave trade, an engine that processed and transported tens of thousands of human lives across a continent, could not have been the work of a single group. It was a brutal but efficient ecosystem, a monstrous food chain with multiple participants, each playing a distinct and indispensable role, each motivated by their own powerful incentives. From the Slavic prince who taxed the trade to the German knight who supplied it and the Jewish merchant who brokered it, the forgotten chains were forged by a diverse and often competing coalition of actors, all of whom were bound together by the immense profitability of the system. To understand how this engine of flesh functioned, one must dissect its machinery and profile the three key groups of human brokers who kept its gears turning: the Slavic rulers who profited from it, the German warriors who fed it, and the Jewish traders who managed its global reach. The first and most powerful of these brokers were the Slavic princes themselves, particularly the Přemyslid dynasty of Bohemia and the nascent Piast dynasty of Poland. These were the local authorities, the men on the ground who transformed their territories from chaotic frontiers into organized hubs of commerce. For a ruler like Duke Boleslaw IV of Bohemia, known as the Cruel, the slave trade was not a sordid sideshow to his power, it was its absolute foundation. He was the guarantor of the entire enterprise. His personal army, his družina, provided the security that protected the great marketplace in Prague from both internal and external threats, ensuring that merchants from across the world could gather and trade with confidence. They policed the trade routes leading to the city, making them safe for the caravans of both captives and cash. In essence, Boleslaus provided the stable, secure, and legally sanctioned environment in which this brutal form of capitalism could flourish. In exchange for this protection, he extracted immense wealth. Every slave sold in the Prague market was subject to a tax, a customs duty paid directly to the duke's treasury. This was not a minor income stream. It was a torrent of cash, a river of Islamic silver that flowed directly into his hands. In a largely cashless world, this gave him an unprecedented advantage. He could use this hard currency to pay his družina, transforming it from a band of loyal followers into a professional, salaried army, a force far more reliable and effective than any of his rivals. He could fund the construction of the first stone castles and churches in Bohemia, tangible symbols of his power and permanence that would awe his subjects and intimidate his enemies. He was, in effect, the CEO of a state whose primary business was the trafficking of human beings. The same model applied to Mieszko Wątpierw, the first historical ruler of Poland. His territory, situated even closer to the pagan Slavic frontier, was a primary source of captives. By controlling the routes by which these captives were brought west to markets like Prague, he too could tap into the river of silver, giving him the economic power needed to unify the Polish tribes and forge them into a coherent state. For these founding fathers of the Slavic nations, the slave trade was the ultimate tool of statecraft. The second key group of brokers were the suppliers, the men who filled the reservoir of souls. These were the German knights and nobles of the Eastern Marches, the warrior aristocracy of Saxony and Bavaria. For these men, the Slavic frontier was a land of opportunity, a place to win glory, land, and, above all, wealth. They were driven by the potent, self-serving ideology of holy war. In their eyes, raiding the pagan Slavs was a pious act, a blow struck for Christendom against the heathens. This religious justification provided a powerful moral carte blanche, allowing for a level of brutality that would have been unacceptable in warfare against fellow Christians. Every captive taken was not just a piece of property, but a soul potentially saved from damnation, a twisted logic that perfectly aligned their faith with their financial interests. These German lords were warrior entrepreneurs. They would lead their formidable, heavily armored cavalry on devastating raids, razzias, into the lands across the Elbe, often in alliance with one Slavic tribe against another. Their primary goal was plunder, and the most valuable and portable form of plunder was people. A successful raid could yield hundreds of captives. These would be marched back to fortified markets on the German side of the frontier, or, more profitably, brought directly to the great international emporium at Prague. Here, the German knight could sell his human cargo for instant payment in high-quality Islamic silver, a form of liquid wealth he desperately needed to maintain his status, pay his own soldiers, and fund his endless political struggles back home. They were the brutal harvesters, the military arm of the great slave trading machine, the indispensable partners of the Slavic princes who provided the marketplace for their grim harvest. The third and final group of brokers were the long-distance merchants who made the entire continental system work. While the local transactions in Prague might have involved various players, the complex, perilous, and politically sensitive task of transporting the slaves from Prague to the markets of Al-Andalus and moving the silver back in the other direction was a specialized niche dominated by Jewish traders. These were the spiritual and professional descendants of the Radhanites, leveraging the same global diaspora network and the same reputation for neutrality. A Christian merchant could not easily travel from the Christian lands of Bohemia, through the Christian kingdom of West Francia, and then into the hostile Muslim Caliphate of Cordoba. He would have been seen as a spy, an enemy, at some point along the journey. A Muslim merchant faced the same problem in reverse. The Jewish merchant, as a member of a tolerated but separate minority in both civilizations, was the only one who could. Their role was multifaceted. In Prague, they were the great international buyers. They had the capital, likely in the form of letters of credit from their partners in Spain, to purchase large numbers of slaves at once. They were also the specialists in the specific demands of the Andalusi market, selecting the captives who would be most valuable as soldiers, servants, or eunuchs. They were the master logisticians, the ones who knew how to organize the massive caravans needed for the 500-mile journey. They knew the routes, the political landscape, and where to bribe the local lords for safe passage. And they were the financiers. The river of silver that flowed from Cordoba was not just carried in sacks. It was likely moved through the same sophisticated system of credit instruments that the Radhanites had perfected, a private, secure banking system that was invisible to the Christian and Muslim rulers through whose lands it passed. Men like Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, the author of our key source, were the embodiment of this class. A Jewish merchant from Muslim Spain, traveling on a diplomatic mission through the German imperial court and reporting on the economic conditions of the Slavic frontier. He was a man who moved between worlds, a living example of the network that held the entire system together. These three groups, the Slavic prince as the local enforcer and taxman, the German knight as the military supplier, and the Jewish merchant as the international broker and financier formed a chain of mutual interest. Each was indispensable to the others, and each profited immensely from their role. It was a dark and terrible symbiosis, an unholy alliance of Christian prince, Christian knight, and Jewish merchant, all cooperating in the systematic exploitation of the pagan Slavs for the immense profits offered by the Islamic Caliphate. It was a forgotten chain of complicity that stretched across the entire continent, a chain forged from greed, violence, and faith, with its terrible central hub firmly anchored in the marketplace of Prague. The cold, hard language of economics, supply, demand, and capital can often mask the profound human reality of the trade. For the brokers of the chain, the captives were a commodity, an abstract unit of value. But for the captives themselves, the journey from their Slavic homeland to the markets of Cordoba was a descent into hell, a physical and psychological ordeal of almost unimaginable horror. This was the long march, a brutal, continent-spanning journey of over 500 miles, a process that systematically stripped them of their identity, their kinship, and their humanity. To trace their path is to make the abstract horror of the trade concrete. It is to follow the forgotten chains not just as a metaphor for an economic system, but as the literal, physical reality of iron shackles and the crushing weight of a life stolen. The journey was a brutal filter, a process of violent selection where only the hardiest, or perhaps the luckiest, would survive to the end of the line. The journey began in a moment of shocking violence. In a small village in the pagan lands east of the Elbe, life was dictated by the rhythm of the seasons. A person's world was defined by their family, their tribe, and the familiar landscape of forests and fields. The arrival of the slavers, whether a German raiding party or warriors from a rival tribe, was an apocalypse. The attack would have been sudden and overwhelming, a chaos of fire, screaming, and the clash of iron. Families were torn apart in minutes. A warrior might be cut down defending his home, his wife and children seized as prizes. A farmer working in his field could be ambushed and clubbed into submission. Those who were not killed outright were rounded up, their hands bound, and roped together in a long line. This was the first moment of commodification. They ceased to be people and became a coffle, a living chain of plunder. Their old lives, their names, their identities were annihilated in the smoke of their burning village. The first leg of the journey was the march from the point of capture to the great market at Prague. This was often a brutal, hurried trek through the wilderness. The captives' force marched by their captors, who were eager to cash in on their prize. They were given minimal food and water, just enough to keep them alive. Those who were too slow, too sick, or too defiant were often killed on the spot, their value as a commodity outweighed by the trouble of transporting them. They would arrive at the outskirts of Prague not as human beings, but as terrified, exhausted, and brutalized livestock. In the marketplace, they were herded into holding pens, their new reality of absolute powerlessness made clear. Here, they were subjected to the ultimate degradation: inspection. Buyers would move through the pens, forcing captives to open their mouths to check their teeth, feeling their limbs for signs of strength or weakness, assessing them with the cold, detached eye of a rancher judging cattle. It was here that families, if any had managed to stay together, were almost certainly broken up for good, as men, women, and children were sorted and sold to different brokers according to the specific demands of the market. For those destined for Al-Andalus, the purchase by a long-distance merchant marked the beginning of the second and longest leg of their journey, the overland caravan route across the entire breadth of Europe. The caravan that left Prague was a massive, highly organized, and heavily armed logistical undertaking. The captives would be chained or yoked together in long lines to prevent escape, guarded by hired mercenaries. The merchants themselves were businessmen, not warriors, and they had to factor the cost of security into every venture. The pace was relentless. The goal was to move the cargo to its destination as quickly and with as little loss as possible. The march would have been a monotonous, daily grind of walking from sunrise to sunset, punctuated by the constant fear of the guards' whips and the gnawing pain of hunger and exhaustion. The route itself was a journey through a bewildering succession of new and terrifying worlds. From Prague, The caravans would have traveled west through the forests of Bohemia and into the more settled lands of the German duchies. They likely passed through major trading towns on the Rhine, like Mainz, where the cargo could be rested, re-provisioned, and perhaps even augmented with new captives. From the Rhineland, the journey continued into the heart of West Francia. Here, in cities like Verdun, some of the caravans would have stopped for the most horrific processing of all, the castration of the young boys destined to become eunuchs. This procedure, carried out in crude conditions and without any anesthetic, was exceptionally dangerous, with appallingly high mortality rates from infection and shock. For the boys who were subjected to it, it was an act of ultimate violation, a physical and psychological mutilation that marked them for life. From Francia, the long march continued south towards the great, formidable barrier of the Pyrenees Mountains. The crossing of these high, snowy passes was one of the most dangerous parts of the entire journey. The cold, the lack of food, and the treacherous terrain would have claimed many of the weaker captives. A person who stumbled and fell here was likely to be left for dead, their chains simply unlocked from the coffle. To the merchants, it was an acceptable loss, a calculated part of the cost of doing business. Those who survived the mountain crossing would finally descend into the entirely different world of the Iberian Peninsula, the land they knew as Al-Andalus. The final destination was the Caliphate's great capital, Cordoba. The arrival in Cordoba was the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new life of servitude. The great slave market of the city was the final point of sale, where the human cargo, having been filtered, processed, and hardened by a journey of over 5,500 miles, was sold to its final owners. Here, the beautiful young women and boys would be purchased. The long, sorrowful march of the captives from Prague to Cordoba was one half of a great, terrible circuit. The other half, the return journey, was a flow of almost unimaginable power, a current that would fundamentally reshape the political landscape of Central Europe. This was the journey of the payment, the river of Islamic silver that flowed north, the direct and tangible profit from the industrial scale trade in human lives. This was the silver dividend, a massive, sustained injection of liquid capital into a society that had, until now, been defined by its lack of it. This torrent of wealth, paid for in human misery, would not be squandered on fleeting luxuries. It would be strategically invested, becoming the seed capital for a political revolution. It was this silver, and this silver alone, that provided the Přemysly dukes of Bohemia and the Piast rulers of Poland with the tools they needed to transform their tribal confederations into true, centralized states. The first coins, the first professional armies, and the first stone castles of Central Europe were all, in a very real sense, built from the profits of the forgotten chains. To understand the scale of this transformation, one must first appreciate the economic reality of Bohemia before the silver dividend. It was a pre-monetary society, its economy a complex web of barter, tribute, and obligation. The duke's power, while supreme in theory, was in practice a constant negotiation. He was the leader of his war band, the Družina, but his warriors' loyalty was personal, secured by his charisma, his military success, and his ability to reward them with a share of plunder, with gifts of land, or with a place at his feasting table. His wealth was the land itself, and the agricultural surplus it produced. He could command the labor of peasants to build a new wooden gourd or to fortify a river crossing, but he could not simply hire a team of specialized stonemasons. His power was immense but illiquid, bound to the soil and to a network of personal loyalties. The arrival of the silver from the Prague slave market shattered this old world. The Duke, particularly the ambitious Boleslaus Fars, was the primary beneficiary. By taxing the immense volume of trade passing through his city, he accumulated a treasury of high-quality Islamic silver dirhams that was unprecedented in the region. Suddenly, he possessed a form of wealth that was abstract, portable, and universally accepted. This was not a gift of land or a share of cattle. It was pure, fungible capital, and it gave him a set of powerful new tools for state building. The first and most dramatic use of this new wealth was a profound act of political and economic declaration. He began to mint his own coins. The first Bohemian denarius, struck in the mid-10th century, was a direct product of the slave trade. The silver was sourced from the melted-down dirhams of the Caliphate, and the technical knowledge was likely provided by the very Jewish merchants who managed the trade. The coin itself was a powerful piece of propaganda. On one side, it might feature a crude cross, signaling his Christian faith, and on the other, his name, Bolesław Dux, a declaration that this was no mere tribal chieftain, but a ruler in the European style. The minting of a national currency was a revolution. It allowed the Duke to standardize his economy, to pay for goods and services with a reliable medium of exchange, and to stamp his own authority on every transaction in his realm. The second, and most critical, investment was in military power. The silver dividend allowed Bolesław to fundamentally restructure his army. He no longer had to rely solely on the conditional loyalty of warriors seeking plunder. He could now pay them a salary. He used his silver to expand and professionalize his družina, creating a standing army of trained, heavily armed soldiers whose primary loyalty was not to a shared tribe or a charismatic leader, but to the paymaster who filled their purses. This was a military revolution. A salaried army was a disciplined army, a force that could be deployed for long campaigns, for garrisoning new forts, and for systematically suppressing any internal rivals who dared to challenge the Duke's authority. This new military power allowed him to expand his control, to unify Bohemia under a single rule, and to project his power far beyond his own borders. His campaigns of conquest, which extended his rule over Silesia, Moravia, and the city of Krakow, were financed by this professional military, which was, in turn, financed by the trade in human flesh. The third great investment was in infrastructure. With his newfound wealth, Bolesław could afford to build in stone, the ultimate symbol of permanence and power in the medieval world. The old, flammable wooden gourds of his ancestors were replaced with the first stone castles and fortified basilicas of Prague. To do this, he needed to hire skilled masons and engineers, specialists who demanded payment in cash. The silver from the slave trade provided the wages. The construction of St. George's Basilica and the fortification of the Prague castle complex were not just acts of piety or defense. They were massive public works projects that demonstrated the Duke's immense wealth and his ambition to create a capital city worthy of a European prince. These stone structures were the tangible, lasting dividend of the brutal commerce in his marketplace, the misery of 1,000 nameless captives, transformed into the enduring foundations of a nation. This same bloody blueprint for state formation was being used, simultaneously, by Bohemia's great rival and partner in the trade, the nascent Kingdom of Poland under Mieszko Warth, situated even closer to the pagan frontier. Mieszko's realm was a primary source for captives, and he controlled the routes that funneled them west to Prague and other markets. He, too, used the immense profits from this trade to consolidate his power. The silver he earned allowed him to subdue the various competing Slavic tribes of the Polish heartland, forcing them into a unified political entity through the sheer force of his superior, paid military. The famous treasure hoards found in Poland from this period, filled with a mixture of Islamic dirhams and early Polish denarii, are a testament to the scale of this wealth. Critically, this silver-fueled power gave Mieszko the strategic autonomy to make the single most important decision in Polish history. In 966, he accepted Christian baptism. This was not the act of a weak ruler succumbing to the pressure of his powerful German neighbors. It was a strategic masterstroke by a wealthy and confident prince. His immense income from the slave trade meant that he did not need the Germans' financial or military support. He could afford to build his own churches, fund his own bishopric, and enter the club of Christian European monarchs on his own terms. His conversion was an act of pragmatic statecraft, and it had a profound economic consequence. By making his people Christian, he theoretically shielded them from being enslaved by other Christians, while simultaneously positioning himself as the legitimate Christian ruler who could continue to profit from the capture and sale of the still pagan tribes on his own eastern border. It was a shrewd and cynical move, a political and religious transformation financed by the very trade it would eventually help to render obsolete. The foundations of Christian Poland, like those of Christian Bohemia, rested on a dark and terrible economic secret. The silver that paid for its first churches was the price of blood. History is rarely a monolith. Even in the most brutal of ages, in systems that seem to operate with a cold and unstoppable logic, there are always voices of dissent, individuals who are willing to stand against the overwhelming tide of economic and political interest in the name of a higher moral principle. The Prague slave trade, for all its immense profitability and its foundational role in state building, was not without its critics. As the 10th century drew to a close, a profound crisis of conscience began to brew in the heart of the Bohemian state. The source of this crisis was the very faith that the Przemyslid dukes had adopted as a tool of their modernization and a symbol of their power: Christianity. The inherent, irreconcilable conflict between the Christian doctrine of charity and the brutal reality of the city's marketplace ignited a fierce internal struggle, a clash between faith and profit that would be embodied in the tragic and inspiring life of a single man, Wojciech Sławik, known to history as Saint Adalbert of Prague. His story is not just a footnote. It is the essential counter-narrative, the conscience of an age. Adalbert was a man born at the nexus of the very forces that defined his world. He was a member of the Slavic dynasty, one of the most powerful noble families in Bohemia and a major political rival to the ruling Przemyslids. His family's wealth and power were, like that of all Bohemian nobles, inextricably linked to the profits of the slave trade. He was a man of his class, educated in the finest schools in Magdeburg, fluent in German and Latin, and destined for a life of power and influence. Yet, from an early age, he was consumed by a fervent, ascetic, and deeply compassionate form of Christianity. He did not see his faith as a mere political convenience or a set of rituals, but as a radical and demanding moral code that called for the protection of the weak and the defense of the innocent. When he was appointed the second bishop of Prague in 982, these two sides of his identity, the worldly prince and the ascetic servant of God, were set on a collision course. Upon assuming his role as the spiritual leader of Bohemia, Adalbert was confronted with a reality that horrified him. He found his flock, from the highest duke to the lowest merchant, to be Christian in name, but pagan in practice. He was appalled by the polygamy, the idolatry, and the general moral laxity he saw around him. But the one sin that overshadowed all others, the great open wound on the soul of his city, was the slave trade. From his new cathedral on the castle hill, he could look down upon the great marketplace, the source of his city's fame and wealth. But he did not see a hub of commerce, he saw a scene from hell. He saw the long coffles of human beings, chained and degraded. He saw Christian nobles profiting from the sale of other human beings, and he saw Christian priests turning a blind eye to the entire enterprise. He recognized the system for what it was, a monstrous hypocrisy, a state that had adopted the cross, but still lived by the sword and the slave chain. Adalbert refused to remain silent. He embarked on a relentless and deeply courageous campaign of moral suasion and direct action against the trade. He used his pulpit to thunder against the sin of slavery, reminding his congregation that according to canon law, it was a mortal sin for a Christian to sell another Christian into servitude, and an even graver sin to sell them to a non-believer, an infidel. This was a direct and deeply subversive attack on the economic foundation of the Bohemian state. He was not just condemning the actions of a few rogue traders, he was challenging the legitimacy of the Duke's primary revenue stream. He confronted the powerful slave-trading nobles in person, accusing them of living in sin and risking eternal damnation. In the famous confrontation with Duke Boleslaus II, he laid the choice bare. You can be a Christian prince, or you can be a slave trader, but you cannot be both. His actions went beyond mere preaching. He began to use the considerable revenues of his bishopric for a program of direct intervention. He would go down into the marketplace himself, a lone figure in his simple bishop's robes amidst the chaos of the trade, and use church funds to ransom captives. He would buy as many slaves as he could afford, particularly the Christian captives who were being illegally sold, and grant them their freedom. This was a powerful symbolic act, a direct rebuke to the commercial ethos of his city. But it was also an unsustainable economic strategy. For every slave he could afford to free, 100 more were waiting in the pens. He was attempting to empty an ocean with a bucket, and his actions only served to further infuriate the powerful elites whose business he was disrupting. The ruling class of Prague, from the duke down to the merchants, saw Adalbert not as a saint, but as a dangerous radical. He was a threat to their prosperity and a challenge to their way of life. His status as a bishop and his powerful family connections protected him for a time, but his position became increasingly untenable. Frustrated and despairing, he twice abandoned his post in Prague to live as a simple monk in an Italian monastery, seeking a purity he could not find in his own city. But he was twice commanded by the Pope to return to his difficult mission. His struggle was a microcosm of a wider conflict that was beginning to stir within the soul of a newly Christianizing Europe. The Church itself was beginning to grapple with the contradiction, with reformers and popes issuing decrees against the enslavement of Christians, even as local bishops and secular lords continued to profit from it. Adalbert was on the bleeding edge of this moral awakening. The final crisis came in 995. While Adalbert was in Rome, his great rivals, the Premislids under Duke Boleslaw II, decided to eliminate his family once and for all. They stormed the Slavic family castle at Libis and massacred almost the entire clan, including Adalbert's 4 brothers. Adalbert, now a bishop in exile, his family murdered and his cause in Prague seemingly lost, made a fateful decision. He would become a missionary. If he could not reform a Christian land that lived like pagans, he would go to the pagans themselves and bring them the true faith. His goal was to travel to the lands of the pagan Prussians, the fierce Baltic tribes who lived on the northeastern frontier of the Polish duke's territory. This was not just a pious mission, it was a continuation of his fight against slavery by other means. He understood the brutal logic of the frontier. As long as these people remained pagan, they would remain a legitimate target for the slave raids that fed the markets he so despised. To convert them was to give them the one shield that could protect them, a Christian identity. His end was as tragic as his life was uncompromising. In 997, after arriving in the lands of the Prussians and beginning to preach, he was met with suspicion and hostility. He was captured by a pagan mob and, refusing to renounce his mission, he was speared to death. His martyrdom, however, was a spectacular political and religious success. The Polish Duke, Boleslaw the Brave, who had been his patron, immediately ransomed his body from the Prussians, paying them its weight in gold, a grimly ironic echo of the slave trade Adalbert had fought. His relics were brought to the Polish capital of Gniezno and became the centerpiece of a new national shrine. Adalbert the martyr achieved what Adalbert the bishop could not. He became the patron saint of a new, fully Christian Poland, his story a foundational myth for a state that was now eager to erase the memory of the bloody commerce that had financed its own creation. His lonely, courageous, and ultimately failed struggle against the forgotten chains was a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of economic systems, the human conscience is never entirely silent. The great brutal engine of flesh that centered on Prague did not run forever. Like all economic systems built on a specific, fragile set of geopolitical conditions, it was destined to decline and fall. By the middle of the 11th century, the vast, industrial-scale slave trade that had forged the first states of Central Europe had dwindled to a shadow of its former self. The marketplace in Prague, once the greatest hub of commerce in the region, lost its sinister preeminence. The long, sorrowful caravans of human beings no longer traced their 1,000-mile path to Cordoba. The forgotten chains were not broken by a single heroic act of abolition, but were slowly, almost imperceptibly, rusted away by a series of profound political, religious, and economic shifts that redrew the map of Europe. The decline of the Prague slave trade was as complex as its rise, a convergence of forces that eliminated both its primary source of supply and its primary center of demand, allowing the new Christian kingdoms of the region to conveniently forget the bloody foundations upon which they had been built. The first and most decisive blow to the system came from its source. The Slavic frontier. The very logic of the trade had rested on a stark religious divide. The captives were legitimate commodities because they were pagans, a status that stripped them of legal and moral protection in the eyes of their Christian and Jewish traders. The single most effective way to protect a people from this predatory system was not to defeat the slavers in battle, but to remove the religious justification for their enslavement. This is precisely what happened in 966, when Mieszko I, the powerful Duke of Poland, strategically and decisively accepted Christian baptism for himself and his entire realm. This was not a purely spiritual decision. It was a masterful act of statecraft, financed by the very trade it would help to dismantle. By joining the club of Christian monarchs, Mieszko instantly transformed his people from a harvestable resource into a protected population. Polish people were now, in the eyes of the Church, no longer legitimate targets for enslavement by their Christian German neighbors. The reservoir of souls had just been dramatically reduced in size. This act created a domino effect. Mieszko and his successors, particularly Bolesław the Brave, now became the champions of Christianization on the eastern frontier. Their expansion was framed not as tribal conquest, but as a holy mission to bring the faith to the remaining pagan tribes, like the Pomeranians and the Prussians. This process of conversion, which would continue for the next 2 centuries, systematically and progressively closed down the old hunting grounds of the slavers. Each tribe that accepted baptism was another source of supply that was taken off the market. While the trade in pagan captives certainly continued on a smaller scale for a long time, the massive, easily accessible reservoir of non-Christian peoples that had existed on the German and Bohemian borders in the 10th century was, by the mid-11th, largely gone. The supply chain had been severed at its root by the very political entities it had helped to create. The children of the slavers had become the protectors of the formerly enslaved. Simultaneously, a catastrophic collapse occurred at the other end of the circuit, the primary center of demand. The Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, the economic superpower whose insatiable appetite for sakaliba, and whose river of silver had powered the entire system, imploded with stunning speed. The early 11th century saw the caliphate descend into a ruinous civil war, a period of chaos known as the Fitna of Al-Andalus. The centralized authority of the caliphs in Cordoba shattered, and by 1031, the once mighty empire had disintegrated into a patchwork of small, competing city-states or taifas. This political collapse had a devastating economic impact. The immense, centralized wealth of the caliph's treasury, which had funded the purchase of thousands of elite slave soldiers and servants, was gone. The grand construction projects ceased. The new Taifa kings, while often culturally brilliant, were politically fragile and militarily weak. They could not afford to import and maintain the vast slave armies of their predecessors. The single, massive, and infinitely wealthy customer who had defined the entire market simply vanished, replaced by a score of smaller, poorer, and less stable buyers. The demand for Slavic slaves did not disappear entirely, but it plummeted. The great engine of appetite in the south had seized up, and the shock was felt all the way up the chain to the forests of Poland. A third, decisive factor was a geological and economic shift that rewired the financial map of Europe. A core reason for the Prague-Cordoba axis had been the flow of silver. Central and Western Europe in the 10th century were silver poor, making them utterly dependent on the high-quality silver of the Islamic world. This dependency gave the Darmites immense power and influence. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, this situation changed dramatically with the discovery of massive new silver deposits in the Harz Mountains of Saxony, in the heart of the German Empire. The mines of Rammelsburg began to produce a torrent of high-quality silver on a scale Europe had not seen since the days of Rome. German emperors like Otto III began to mint vast quantities of their own silver pennies, creating a stable, locally sourced currency. This was a financial revolution. European economies were no longer as dependent on the influx of Islamic silver. A Bohemian duke could now trade for German pennies as easily as for Arab dirhams, reorienting his economic focus north and west. The rise of European silver did not stop the slave trade, but it broke the exclusive, symbiotic relationship with the silver of Al-Andalus, weakening the primary financial incentive that had made the Long March so profitable. With the supply choked off, the demand shattered, and the financial incentives reoriented, the great Prague slave market faded into relative obscurity. The city's economy diversified, its role as a legitimate east-west trading hub for more conventional goods coming to the fore. The memory of its dark origins was actively suppressed. The new Christian kingdoms of Bohemia and Poland, now adorned with stone churches and bishoprics, had a powerful incentive to forget the bloody commerce that had financed their own baptisms. Their new foundational myths were stories of saints and kings, of pious conversions and heroic battles, not of the grim marketplace and the human coffles that had been their first great source of wealth. History is written by the victors, and the victors of this new order had no interest in documenting the inconvenient and horrifying truths about their own origins. The chains were not just broken, they were forgotten. The silence in the historical record is not an accident. It is the final, successful act of a civilization erasing its own guilty past, leaving behind only the faint, ghostly traces in the accounts of foreign travelers and the despairing cries of a local saint. Our investigation has brought to light a dark and foundational chapter in the creation of modern Europe. We have demonstrated that the city of Prague in the 10th century was not a peripheral backwater, but the brutal and efficient heart of a vast continental slave trade. This engine of flesh functioned as a crucial economic hub, a central marketplace that connected the two great and opposing poles of its age. It systematically funneled a tragic and seemingly inexhaustible supply of human beings, the pagan Slavic tribes captured on the violent eastern frontier, to the single wealthiest and most demanding customer in Europe, the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, with its insatiable appetite for the slave soldiers and servants known as the Sakaliba. We have traced the unholy alliance of brokers who managed this trade, the German knights who supplied the captives through holy war and raiding, the Jewish merchants who leveraged their unique international network to manage the logistics and finances of the 500-mile journey, and, most critically, the Slavic princes of Bohemia and Poland themselves. We have argued that these rulers were not passive bystanders, but active participants and primary beneficiaries. By providing the secure environment for this commerce and taxing it heavily, they harnessed a torrent of Islamic silver, a silver dividend of almost unimaginable scale. Finally, we have shown that this river of silver, paid for in human misery, was the foundational capital that directly financed the birth of the first great Central European states. This wealth allowed the dukes of Bohemia and Poland to mint their first national currencies, to pay for professional standing armies, and to build the first stone castles and churches that cemented their authority. The story of the forgotten chains reveals a brutal pragmatism at the heart of state formation, demonstrating that the very genesis of these proud Christian kingdoms was secretly and inextricably linked to a dark, symbiotic, and morally horrifying economic entanglement with the Islamic world they often saw as their rival. The story of the forgotten chains is deeply uncomfortable. It forces us to confront a history that is far messier, more compromised, and more brutal than the heroic national myths we often prefer. The clean, triumphant narrative of the birth of Christian kingdoms in Central Europe, tales of pious kings, holy saints, and civilizing missions, dissolves under the weight of this evidence, replaced by a far more complex and troubling story of economic pragmatism. The Prague slave trade reveals that state formation is not always a noble project. It is often a ruthless business, an enterprise that requires immense capital, and the source of that capital is frequently dark and morally compromised. The first armies, the first coins, and the first stone buildings of Bohemia and Poland were all bought and paid for by the sale of human beings. This history also forces a radical re-evaluation of the relationship between the Christian and Islamic worlds in the Middle Ages. It shatters the simplistic model of a perpetual clash of civilizations. The forgotten chains show us a world not of neat division, but of deep and profound economic symbiosis. The Christian knights of Germany and the Christian dukes of Bohemia were, in a very real sense, the primary suppliers for the human resource needs of the Muslim Caliph of Cordoba. They were not just enemies, they were indispensable, if unwitting, business partners in a continental system that grotesquely benefited them both. It is a stark reminder that even in ages of intense ideological hostility, the underlying forces of supply and demand can create powerful, secret connections, forging a shared economy even between the most bitter of rivals. Why was this history so completely and utterly forgotten? The answer is as disturbing as the trade itself. The chains were forgotten because it was in the interest of everyone involved to forget them. The new Christian kingdoms of Bohemia and Poland, having built their foundations on this brutal commerce, had every incentive to erase it from their official histories, replacing it with the more palatable story of their conversion, as personified by the heroic martyr, Saint Adalbert. The German chroniclers preferred to frame their eastern expansion as a noble crusade, not a sordid slave-raiding enterprise. For 1,000 years, this silence was near total. The story survived only in the margins, in the frank but obscure accounts of traveling merchants like Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, and in the despairing cries of saints who lost their battle against the economic tide. The legacy of the forgotten chains is, therefore, a lesson in the power of historical forgetting. It shows how easily the most inconvenient and foundational truths of a nation's origin can be buried beneath layers of myth and silence. It is a cautionary tale that compels us to look beneath the surface of our own foundational stories, to ask what uncomfortable truths and what forgotten chains might lie hidden in the basements of our own national histories. The great marketplace of Prague has long since vanished, but the questions it raises are timeless. What price is a civilization willing to pay for its own creation? And what dark bargains are its future generations willing to forget?